The arena was sold out months in advance. Premium tickets were reselling for $5,000 a pop. Television networks had already locked in their biggest advertising deals of the year, confident they'd found the ratings goldmine they'd been chasing forever. The WNBA's 2026 All-Star Weekend in Chicago was supposed to be a coronation, the moment women's basketball officially crossed over into mainstream superstardom. Everything was positioned perfectly. The infrastructure was flawless. The hype was real. And then, 2 days before opening ceremonies, the entire operation detonated. Caitlin Clark wasn't showing up. Not to the three-point shootout, not to the red carpet, not to the press conferences, not to any of it. She pulled a complete no-show, and she did it deliberately. Within hours, the secondary ticket market collapsed entirely. Premium resale prices plummeted to nothing. Corporate sponsors threatened lawsuits. Television executives melted down. The league went from celebrating their best year in history to watching their flagship weekend implode in real time. What actually triggered the biggest player revolt in recent sports history requires understanding the exact conditions that made such a rebellion possible. The WNBA had finally reached an inflection point. For years, women's professional basketball existed in a financial gray zone, generating enough revenue to survive, but not enough to truly thrive. Franchises operated on modest budgets. Salaries were competitive within the league, but laughably small compared to NBA standards. Television contracts existed more out of charitable obligation than genuine market demand. The sport had passionate fans, absolutely, but the casual audience remained elusive. That all started changing with Caitlin Clark's arrival. Her impact was immediate and measurable across every conceivable metric. Attendance numbers at Fever games jumped by percentages that seemed almost fictional. Season ticket sales increased dramatically. Merchandise featuring her name and number flew off digital shelves faster than suppliers could restock inventory. Social media engagement tripled overnight, then quadrupled. Every statistical measure of cultural relevance and market penetration showed explosive growth. But more importantly, the revenue streams that had been stagnant for years suddenly started flowing in directions they hadn't moved in decades. Sponsorship interest intensified. Broadcasting rights became more valuable. Corporate partners who'd previously shown minimal interest in women's basketball suddenly wanted meaningful connections to this emerging superstar. The television ratings told the most compelling story. Games that historically averaged modest viewership numbers were suddenly drawing audiences that competed with major sporting events. Networks noticed. Advertisers noticed. Wall Street analysts who'd written off women's basketball as a perpetual money-losing venture suddenly started issuing positive outlooks on the market's potential. And at the center of all this transformation was one rookie point guard whose talent and marketability had single-handedly altered the industry's trajectory. The WNBA had discovered something it had been searching for since its inception: a mainstream crossover superstar who could generate genuine interest beyond the traditional basketball audience. This transformation created a complex dynamic within the league. On one level, everyone benefited from Clark's presence and performance. Higher overall television ratings lifted all boats. Enhanced sponsorship interest provided resources that benefited every franchise. The cultural relevance that came from her success elevated the sport's entire profile. But this broad benefit masked underlying tensions that were festering beneath the surface, particularly among veteran players who'd carried the league through leaner years. These athletes had sacrificed significantly to build women's professional basketball into something legitimate and sustainable. They'd played in front of modest crowds. They'd accepted salaries that required off-season employment to achieve genuine financial security. They'd invested their careers in developing a sport that most casual fans barely acknowledged. Then a rookie arrived, played her first season, and suddenly became the biggest story in women's sports. The spotlight shifted dramatically. Press credentials that had gone unclaimed for years were suddenly hotly contested. Arenas that had operated at partial capacity were suddenly selling out, but the narrative focus changed as well. Instead of celebrating the veterans who'd built the foundation, media coverage increasingly centered on the newcomer. Interviews started with questions about Clark. Feature stories highlighted her college dominance and rookie transition. Highlight reels emphasized her three-point shooting and court vision. The veteran players who'd anchored the league weren't being ignored exactly, but they were definitely being overshadowed. This created a resentment that simmered quietly for months. Private conversations took place among the established stars. Whispered discussions happened in locker rooms about fairness and equity and who deserved recognition for building the league. These conversations started with legitimate grievances. These veterans had absolutely sacrificed more and received less recognition than they deserved. But those legitimate grievances gradually morphed into something uglier. The narrative shifted from, "we deserve more respect," to, "she shouldn't be getting this much attention." The focus transitioned from celebrating their own accomplishments to diminishing hers. What started as reasonable resentment evolved into something closer to professional jealousy and insecurity. The most damaging aspect was that these conversations weren't happening in isolation. Veteran players started recruiting league management into this narrative. They whispered to executives about the importance of protecting younger players from overexposure, about the value of distributing attention more equitably, about the risks of allowing one player to become too dominant. They framed concerns about fairness and league balance as justification for what was actually motivated by ego. And the executives, whether through genuine agreement or simply through a desire to maintain relationships with powerful veteran players, started buying into this framing. They began discussing how to manage Clark's impact in ways that felt less like suppression and more like responsible league governance. Nobody explicitly said the goal was to diminish her performance or limit her opportunity to shine. Instead, the language became about protection, balance, and equity. These words made the underlying scheme sound reasonable, maybe even noble, but everyone involved understood the actual motivation. This wasn't about safeguarding a young player's health or creating league balance. This was about managing the egos of veteran athletes who felt threatened by a rookie's emergence. This was about executives attempting to control a situation that was generating unprecedented revenue, but also threatening established power structures. The groundwork for disaster was being laid, and everyone with real institutional power seemed to agree that suppression disguised as protection was the appropriate response. 2 days before the All-Star Showcase was supposed to tip off, something happened that would ultimately prove to be a catastrophically poor decision disguised as routine administrative business. League coordinators and Indiana Fever management held a meeting. This wasn't scheduled as a major strategic session. There was no public announcement, no media notification, no transparency about what would be discussed or decided. Instead, it was framed as a routine coordination call between league offices and one franchise regarding playing time management for their star player. Only the key decision-makers were in the room. No agents, no player representatives, no outside observers who might raise questions about what was being proposed. Just executives discussing strategy in private, which is where all the worst decisions in professional sports seem to happen. The meeting had one central purpose. The league and the Fever had decided that Caitlin Clark would be subject to severe playing time restrictions during the All-Star exhibition game. That was the actual decision being formalized. But before presenting this restriction to Clark, they needed to craft a narrative that would make it sound reasonable, that would prevent immediate rebellion, that would position this limitation as something other than what it actually was. So they developed a framework. They would present the restriction as a health and wellness protocol. They would explain it as protecting her body from overuse. They would frame it as standard rest management for a young player who'd been dealing with recent injury concerns. None of this framing was dishonest exactly. Health was a genuine consideration. But it wasn't the primary motivation, and everyone in that room understood that perfectly. The actual mechanism of the restriction was deliberately designed to be subtle while still achieving its real purpose. Clark would be allowed playing time, but only in the first and third quarters. She'd be benched during the second and fourth quarters, which historically received the most television exposure and the most intense media focus. This way, the All-Star game could still capitalize on her name value and reputation to drive ticket sales and initial viewership. The promotion could still feature her prominently. Her presence would still be part of the marketing message, but her actual opportunity to dominate the game, to create highlight reel moments, to steal the show from veteran players who'd organized this entire arrangement. That would be severely limited. They could have her name on the marquee while keeping her off the court during the moments when that mattered most. It was a scheme designed to extract maximum benefit from her presence while minimizing her impact. What's particularly striking about this approach is how transparently it revealed the insecurity driving these decisions. If the league and the veteran players had genuine confidence in their own abilities and entertainment value, they wouldn't need to artificially suppress a competitor. They'd trust that their talent and experience could compete favorably against any rookie, regardless of how talented she was. But instead, they were proposing an architectural solution to a confidence problem. They were essentially acknowledging that they couldn't win the competition for attention fairly, so they were going to rig the game. They couldn't prevent Clark from being more exciting or more marketable, so they were going to prevent her from having the opportunity to demonstrate those qualities on the biggest stage. The executives who participated in this meeting almost certainly believed they were being clever. They probably thought they'd found a solution that accomplished their actual goal while maintaining plausible deniability. The health framing provided cover. The restriction was real but not absolute, so it couldn't be easily characterized as sabotage. They could argue that the decision was about player welfare and league management, not about suppressing individual talent out of jealousy. But this analysis reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of who they were actually dealing with. Caitlin Clark wasn't some young player desperate to earn respect from established authority figures. She was a superstar coming from a historically dominant college program, someone who'd been celebrated as the best prospect in her draft class, someone who knew exactly how valuable she was and what she'd accomplished to achieve that status. The executives were operating from an outdated playbook. They were assuming that institutional authority still worked the way it had decades earlier, when players had limited options and needed access to professional leagues to achieve their dreams and secure their financial futures. But the market had shifted. There were more opportunities available to elite athletes. Social media meant that superstars could build personal brands independently of traditional institutional structures. The globalization of women's basketball meant that extraordinary talent could find opportunities anywhere in the world. Caitlin Clark didn't need the WNBA the way previous generations of players had needed it. She could have gone anywhere. She could have played overseas, done exhibition tour, built her brand through content creation and endorsement deals. She'd chosen the WNBA, but that choice came from a position of strength, not desperation. The executives decided to present these restrictions to Clark in a formal boardroom setting, as if the decision had already been made and she was simply being informed of her obligations. They apparently believed that the combination of league authority, institutional power, and the framing of the restriction as being for her own good would result in immediate compliance. They were about to discover exactly how wrong that calculation was. When Caitlin Clark walked into that boardroom, she was entering a situation she'd probably anticipated. Word travels quickly in professional sports. Athletes have networks. Rumors about playing time restrictions and veteran player concerns almost certainly reached her before the formal meeting occurred. She likely knew exactly what she was walking into. What the executives apparently didn't anticipate was that she'd already decided how she was going to respond. And that response wasn't going to involve negotiation or compromise or any attempt to work within the system they were presenting. The moment they finished explaining the restriction, the health protocol reasoning, the league's justification for limiting her minutes to the first and third quarters while benching her during peak television exposure, Clark's response was immediate and absolute. According to reports from people who were in that room or spoke with people who were, she didn't ask questions about the reasoning. She didn't propose modifications or compromises. She didn't attempt to negotiate better terms or push back on specific aspects of the restriction while accepting the broader framework. Instead, she rejected the entire premise completely. She made it clear that she understood the actual motivation behind this decision, that she wasn't interested in accepting artificial limitations designed to protect veteran players' egos, and that she would not participate in a scheme that disguised professional jealousy as health management. More importantly, she laid out the consequences of the league's decision. If they insisted on implementing these playing time restrictions, If they demanded that she accept benching during the most important moments of the game, if they tried to suppress her performance in service of veteran player egos, then she simply wouldn't show up. She wouldn't board the jet to Chicago. She wouldn't participate in any aspect of All-Star Weekend. She wouldn't be available for press conferences or red carpet appearances or exhibition games or any of it. The league could have its All-Star Weekend, but they'd have it without her. And she was absolutely prepared to accept the professional and financial consequences of that decision if necessary. Then she stood up and walked out of that boardroom. What's remarkable about this moment is how thoroughly it shattered the executive's entire framework for understanding their power and leverage in this situation. They'd approached the meeting from a position of assuming authority and expecting compliance. They thought they understood the hierarchy. They thought they could dictate terms to a player they controlled. But Clark demonstrated, in the most unambiguous way possible, that their assumed authority was actually dependent on her willingness to accept it. She could walk away. She was willing to walk away, and there was nothing they could do to prevent that from happening. This moment also reflected a generational shift in how young athletes understand their own value and negotiating position. Clark belonged to a generation that had grown up with social media and alternative platforms. She understood that her personal brand didn't depend entirely on traditional institutional structures. She knew that she could generate significant income and cultural relevance through content creation, endorsement deals, and direct audience engagement without needing a professional league as the intermediary. This knowledge gave her a freedom that previous generations of athletes hadn't possessed. She could afford to walk away because she had other options. She wasn't trapped. She wasn't desperate. She was negotiating from genuine strength. After leaving that boardroom, Clark took actions that made her position crystal clear. She refused to board the private jet scheduled to transport the team to Chicago. She didn't attend mandatory meetings. She didn't show up to any of the preparatory activities that all-star players are expected to participate in. She essentially ghosted the entire event while making it obvious that this was a deliberate choice rather than a logistical error or health issue. Her silence was strategic. She wasn't giving interviews explaining her position. She wasn't going public with complaints about playing time restrictions. She was simply not there, letting her absence speak louder than any statement could have. The league initially believed she was bluffing. They thought this was a high-stakes negotiation where Clark was using dramatic gestures to extract concessions, but would ultimately back down once she realized the magnitude of the professional consequences. They were certain that, as the All-Star Weekend approached, as she felt the pressure from media questions about her absence, as she understood what missing this event would cost her in terms of exposure and endorsement opportunities, she'd eventually cave and show up ready to play under whatever terms the league had established. This confidence in her eventual capitulation reveals how fundamentally they'd misunderstood the situation and the person they were dealing with. Clark wasn't interested in negotiating for better terms within the system they'd created. She wasn't trying to extract concessions that would give her more playing time while ultimately accepting the basic framework. She was rejecting the entire system. She was drawing a line and refusing to accept disrespect, regardless of the professional cost. That willingness to sacrifice short-term gain for long-term principle is what separated her from players who might have tried to work within the constraints and hope for better treatment eventually. She wasn't hoping. She was acting. As the countdown to All-Star Weekend ticked closer and Caitlin Clark remained absolutely nowhere near Chicago, something started becoming undeniably clear to league executives. This wasn't a negotiation tactic. This wasn't a power play designed to extract concessions that she'd ultimately accept. This was a genuine withdrawal from the event, and it was going to proceed regardless of what the league did or offered in response. The moment this reality sank in, the actual economic consequences started becoming visible, and they were catastrophic far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The secondary ticket market, which had represented some of the most valuable sports inventory available, essentially imploded within hours of Clark's no-show being confirmed. Premium courtside seats that had been reselling for $5,000, suddenly had no buyers. Resale platforms that had been bustling with activity went silent. People who'd invested enormous sums of money into experiencing All-Star Weekend suddenly found their investment worth a fraction of what they'd paid. The economic loss was staggering and immediate. Fans who'd spent life-changing money to see the sport's most exciting talent perform in person suddenly found themselves holding tickets to a fundamentally different event than what they'd paid for. This created an immediate customer service nightmare. Ticket holders started demanding refunds. They argued, with legitimate justification, that they'd purchased access to an event specifically because of Clark's participation. They'd paid premium prices because the event was promoted around her presence and capability to create exciting basketball moments. Now they were being asked to attend that same event without the marquee attraction they'd actually paid for. The ticket vendors and the league were suddenly flooded with refund requests. People were angry, people felt deceived, and they had legitimate grounds for those complaints. The television networks were experiencing their own version of panic. Major broadcast partners had invested substantially in advertising inventory, specifically designed around Clark's guaranteed appearance and performance. They'd sold advertising time to corporate clients based on projected viewership numbers that were heavily dependent on her playing. Network executives had made confident projections to their advertising partners about audience reach and engagement, promising premium rates justified by the talent that would be on display. Now that talent was gone, and those advertising projections became suddenly unrealistic. The networks faced the prospect of having sold advertising time at premium rates for an event that would deliver substantially lower viewership than promised. This created potential legal liability for breach of contract. Network executives were reportedly having angry phone calls with league leadership, threatening material breach of contract litigation if the situation wasn't remedied. They were discussing whether they had grounds to cancel the broadcast entirely or demand significant refunds to advertising partners. The television rights fees that had seemed like such a victory when they were negotiated suddenly felt like they might turn into financial disasters if the product being delivered wasn't what was promised. The ripple effects extended across the entire media ecosystem. Publications had committed to extensive all-star coverage based on the assumption that the event would feature the sport's most exciting talent. Camera crews had been scheduled. Journalists had planned their coverage around Clark's expected performance. Everything was predicated on her presence and participation. But the most directly damaging impact came from corporate sponsorships. Major international brands had invested 8 figures in being associated with the All-Star Weekend, specifically because they wanted association with Caitlin Clark and the excitement she generated. These weren't companies that were generically interested in supporting women's basketball. They were companies that had calculated the return on investment based on her specific drawing power. Remove her from the equation, and the value proposition fundamentally changed. Corporate sponsors started threatening to cancel their financial backing. They argued that they'd paid premium rates for association with a specific event and a specific athlete. If that event didn't feature that athlete, then they'd paid for something that was materially different from what was promised. The speed and scale of this economic collapse was almost unprecedented in professional sports. It normally takes significant time for financial consequences to ripple through a complex ecosystem. But in this case, the impact was immediate because the correlation between Clark's participation and the event's value was so transparently obvious. Everyone involved understood exactly why ticket prices had been so high, why television networks had paid so much for broadcast rights, why corporate sponsors had committed so much money. It wasn't because of the abstract value of women's basketball or the All-Star game as a concept. It was specifically because Caitlin Clark was going to be there creating excitement and driving viewership and engagement. Without her, the entire value proposition collapsed. League executives were watching their biggest economic event of the year implode in real time. They were receiving calls from furious ticket holders demanding refunds, from television networks threatening lawsuits, from corporate sponsors canceling deals, from media outlets questioning the competence of league leadership. The financial losses were staggering. Revenue that had been guaranteed weeks earlier was evaporating by the hour. and there was absolutely nothing the league could do to reverse the situation except convince Clark to return, which she'd shown absolutely no willingness to do. They'd fundamentally miscalculated the extent to which their entire enterprise depended on her willingness to participate, and now they were paying the price for that miscalculation in the most brutal fashion imaginable. Meanwhile, the veteran players who'd orchestrated this entire arrangement were experiencing their own version of a reckoning, though their situation was psychologically more complicated and perhaps ultimately more painful. They'd successfully achieved their primary objective. They'd removed Caitlin Clark from the All-Star weekend. The spotlight they'd wanted to shine on themselves was suddenly available. The stage that had been threatened by her dominance was now entirely theirs. The arena was packed. The cameras were rolling. The media attention was focused on the event. Everything they'd supposedly wanted had been delivered, except they quickly discovered that what they'd wanted and what they actually needed were two fundamentally different things. The absence of Clark didn't create the favorable conditions they'd anticipated. Instead, it created an oppressive silence. The energy in the arena was noticeably diminished. Crowds weren't reacting to plays with the same intensity they normally would. The television coverage wasn't capturing exciting moments being discussed on social media with the same urgency. The narrative around the game wasn't about excellent basketball being played by veteran superstars. It was about a notable absence, about a star player's refusal to participate, about the league's mismanagement and poor decision-making. The cameras that were focused on the game were simultaneously capturing the elephant in the room, the fact that the sport's biggest attraction wasn't there. Every post-game interview felt hollow. Reporters were asking the veteran players how they felt about the spotlight now that Clark was gone. Players were being asked to respond to questions about the circumstances that had led to her absence rather than discussing their own performances. The conversation wasn't about celebrating their excellence. It was about discussing the failed attempt to suppress a competitor. Their moment on the biggest stage of the year was being completely overshadowed by the controversy surrounding the decisions that had created the situation in the first place. They'd wanted the attention, but they were getting the wrong kind of attention. They wanted to be celebrated for their talent. Instead, they were being interrogated about their jealousy and insecurity. More fundamentally, the veteran players were confronting a harsh reality about their own market value and relevance. They'd convinced themselves that without Clark's presence, they could capture the audience's attention and generate excitement. But what actually happened was that the audience largely didn't care about the event at all without her. The arena felt empty despite being physically full. Viewers tuned out. Social media engagement disappeared. The event that was supposed to celebrate their excellence instead exposed the extent to which their relevance was entirely dependent on the presence of someone more interesting and exciting than they were. This created a situation where the veterans had won the competition they'd orchestrated, but discovered that winning that competition was worthless. They'd successfully eliminated their competition for attention, only to realize that there was no attention worth having without the competition. Clark had been like a rising tide lifting all boats. Her presence, even if it meant playing second fiddle to her exciting performances, had kept the entire sport in the spotlight. Without her, the entire ecosystem collapsed. The veteran players were left standing on a stage that nobody was watching, playing basketball that nobody particularly cared about, while the narrative of the event was entirely focused on their failure to manage a situation they thought they controlled. The psychological toll of this situation was significant. These were accomplished athletes who dedicated their careers to women's basketball. They'd made sacrifices and worked incredibly hard to achieve excellence in their sport. They deserved respect and recognition. But their attempt to claim that respect and recognition by suppressing a competitor had backfired so completely that it had done the opposite of what they'd intended. Instead of elevating their profiles, it had exposed them as petty and insecure. Instead of celebrating their excellence, the media was discussing their jealousy. They tried to protect their legacies by limiting a younger player's opportunity to shine. And instead, they'd ensured that their all-star appearances that year would be remembered primarily as cautionary tales about professional jealousy and the dangers of institutional hubris. What made this situation even more complicated was that many of these veteran players had legitimate grievances. They had sacrificed significantly to build women's professional basketball into something legitimate and sustainable. They had played in front of modest crowds. They had accepted salaries that required off-season employment. They had invested their careers in developing a sport that most casual fans barely acknowledged. Their resentment about not receiving proportional recognition was actually understandable. But they'd allowed that understandable resentment to morph into something destructive, and that transformation had cost them far more than they'd ever gained from their attempt to suppress Clark. What became absolutely undeniable in the wake of this disaster was that Caitlin Clark held significantly more power than anyone in league leadership had wanted to acknowledge. This wasn't a theoretical realization based on market analysis or financial projections. This was a starkly obvious, practically impossible to dispute conclusion based on the actual material consequences of her absence. When she didn't show up, the event collapsed economically. When she withdrew her participation, revenue streams disappeared instantly. When she refused to accept playing time restrictions, the league's entire scheme fell apart despite their apparent institutional authority and control. The power dynamic that supposedly existed, where the organization controlled the players and could dictate terms, was revealed to be completely inverted when it actually came time to exercise that assumed power. This power wasn't just about basketball skill, though Clark's talent was obviously elite. It wasn't just about marketability or popularity, though she was undeniably the sport's most compelling attraction. The power came from the fact that she was irreplaceable. There was no backup plan. There was no substitute that could be deployed if she refused to cooperate. The league couldn't simply replace her with another point guard if she wouldn't accept their conditions. Other players couldn't step in and provide the same level of excitement and revenue generation. The audience had come specifically to see her. Sponsors had paid specifically for association with her. Television networks had made decisions about broadcast priority specifically because of her. She was the reason the entire ecosystem functioned. Remove her, and the entire structure collapsed. The executives who were frantically trying to recover from this situation were experiencing the humbling realization that they'd fundamentally misunderstood who actually held power in this relationship. They thought they held power because they controlled access to the platform. The All-Star Game was supposed to be the prize that players desperately wanted. Playing in it was supposed to be a privilege that would ensure compliance with league directives. But Clark had demonstrated that for a superstar of her caliber, missing an All-Star Game didn't diminish her brand or her long-term prospects. If anything, it enhanced both. Every day she remained absent, her legend grew larger. Every moment the league struggled without her, her irreplaceability became more obvious. She'd called their bluff, and they had no cards left to play with. This created a cascade of consequences for how the league would have to operate moving forward. They were forced to grovel. League executives were frantically reaching out to Clark's representatives, offering concessions and attempting to salvage the situation. They promised to completely eliminate the playing time restrictions. They promised to allow her total offensive freedom. They offered additional bonuses and endorsement opportunities and anything else they could think of that might convince her to return. But Clark wasn't interested in negotiating. She'd already made her point. She'd demonstrated her power. She'd made it clear that she wouldn't accept disrespect regardless of professional consequences. What additional leverage could the league possibly offer her at this point? Any concessions they made now would simply be admitting that they'd been wrong all along, that they'd made terrible decisions, that they should have recognized her value and power from the beginning. The broader implications of this power shift extended far beyond just Caitlin Clark's relationship with the league. Every other player in the Wnba was watching this situation unfold and understanding, with crystalline clarity, what it meant for their own negotiating positions. If Clark could walk away from the All-Star weekend and come out of the situation with more power than she did going in, what did that say about the leverage available to every other player? If the league couldn't maintain authority over its biggest superstar, how could it expect compliance from anyone else? The entire power structure that had governed professional women's basketball for decades was being fundamentally rewritten. Players were suddenly understanding that the assumption of institutional authority was an illusion. The league only had power to the extent that players granted it to them. And if players were willing to demonstrate their own indispensability, if they were willing to walk away and prove how much they actually mattered, they could fundamentally reshape their relationship with the organization. The playing time restrictions that Clark refused to accept would have been quietly implemented for less prominent players, and nobody would have made a fuss about it. But because she was unwilling to accept disrespect, because she was willing to sacrifice personal gain to maintain her dignity and integrity, she'd essentially opened a door for every other player to recognize their own power. The executives who ran the league were suddenly confronted with the fact that their business model had fundamentally changed. They could no longer operate under the assumption that they controlled the platform and therefore controlled the players. They had to recognize that superstar players held significant leverage over how the sport was operated. Every future negotiation would be conducted with this understanding as the foundation. Every restriction, every limitation, every institutional control mechanism would now be questioned in light of what had happened. The league had just demonstrated, in the most public and expensive way possible, that you cannot dictate terms to your most valuable assets if those assets have the courage to walk away and prove their own indispensability. What happened that All-Star Weekend represented far more than just a dispute between a superstar player and league management. It represented a generational shift in how young athletes understand their own value and negotiate with institutional authority. This moment would echo through professional women's basketball for decades, and the ripple effects would eventually extend into other sports as well. The precedent being established was simple but profound. Superstars have leverage, and institutions that fail to recognize and respect that leverage do so at their own peril. Caitlin Clark belonged to a generation of athletes who had grown up with fundamentally different circumstances than previous players. She had multiple options available to her. She could have played overseas in leagues with significant resources and global reach. She could have pursued professional opportunities outside of basketball entirely. She could have focused on content creation and direct audience engagement without needing a professional league as an intermediary. She understood her own market value completely because that value wasn't theoretical. It was demonstrated daily through social media engagement, merchandise sales, and the behavior of corporate sponsors who desperately wanted to associate themselves with her. This understanding gave her freedom that previous generations hadn't possessed. The executives and veteran players who attempted to suppress her made their fundamental miscalculation did any individual player. They assumed that institutional authority would be respected because players were socialized to understand hierarchy and comply with organizational directives. They assumed that the threat of career consequences would ultimately compel compliance even when those consequences felt unfair. All of these assumptions turned out to be wrong when applied to a superstar with genuine alternatives and the willingness to use them. This moment also exposed something important about the economics of women's sports that had been obscured by years of modest financial performance. Women's sports could generate genuine, substantial revenue if the conditions were right. The Wnba had been struggling financially not because women's basketball fundamentally couldn't be profitable, but because the sport hadn't yet found its mainstream crossover star who could attract casual audiences. Caitlin Clark was that star, and the moment she arrived, the entire economic structure of the sport shifted. This exposed the extraordinary extent to which the league's prosperity was dependent on her participation and performance. Corporate sponsors that had been lukewarm about women's basketball suddenly became intensely interested when Caitlin Clark was involved. They weren't funding the league generically. They were funding her specifically because she represented a connection to audiences they wanted to reach. Television networks that had treated women's basketball as an obligation suddenly started treating it as an opportunity because they understood that her performance could generate compelling television content. Casual fans who'd never previously paid attention to women's basketball were suddenly becoming regular viewers. All of this economic transformation traced directly back to one player, and that economic reality gave her leverage that institutional structures couldn't simply ignore. The situation also demonstrated how fragile institutional power actually is when it's not backed up by genuine respect and mutual benefit. The WNBA's leadership thought they held power because they controlled the platform. But platforms are only valuable if they have audiences, and audiences came because of Caitlin Clark. Remove her, and the platform became worthless. The institution suddenly found itself completely dependent on her goodwill and cooperation. This revealed that the power structure wasn't nearly as solid as it had seemed when Clark was still participating. It was predicated entirely on her willingness to accept it. Looking forward, the implications of this situation would fundamentally reshape how professional women's basketball operated. Organizations would have to balance the needs of various players differently. They'd have to recognize that superstar players with genuine market value couldn't be managed using the same hierarchical control structures that worked with everyone else. Veteran players would have to accept that young talent with higher drawing power would receive more attention and opportunity, at least until their own value proposition changed. And every player in the league would understand, from this moment forward, that institutional authority wasn't absolute. They had more power than they'd previously recognized, and they could exercise that power if circumstances demanded it. This moment also raised important questions about fairness and equity in how professional sports organizations are structured. Institutions that are dependent on the goodwill and cooperation of their employees need to treat those employees with respect, particularly when those employees are generating substantial value. The WNBA had attempted to treat Caitlin Clark with disrespect while simultaneously depending entirely on her to generate the revenue and attention that kept the organization viable. That fundamental contradiction became unsustainable, and she forced the organization to confront it by refusing to participate. What lessons the league actually learned from this situation would determine how it operated moving forward and whether similar conflicts could be prevented in the future. The incident at the 2026 All-Star Weekend would prove to be a watershed moment that fundamentally altered the dynamics of professional women's basketball forever. Even when Caitlin Clark eventually returned, and the league attempted to patch things up with improved compensation and promises of better treatment, the damage to the old power structure was irreversible. The institutional hierarchy that had governed professional women's basketball for decades had been shattered in the most public and economically painful way possible. And that shattering would have consequences that rippled through every subsequent negotiation and interaction between league leadership and its players. Every negotiation moving forward would be conducted with the understanding that players held significantly more power than the previous institutional structure had acknowledged. When contracts came up for renewal, players and their agents would remember this moment. They'd reference it. They'd use it as evidence that they had leverage the league couldn't ignore. Organizations that attempted to impose restrictions or limitations on superstar players would immediately face the threat of withdrawal. The institutional assumptions that had made simple control trading the original playing time restrictions would face consequences of their own that extended far beyond just one weekend. Their reputations had been damaged. Fans and media understood what they'd tried to do and why they'd tried to do it. They'd been exposed as petty and insecure, and that exposure would follow them for the rest of their careers. More importantly, they'd learned an expensive lesson about how professional jealousy and institutional politics can blow back catastrophically when directed at someone with genuine power and leverage. Their attempt to suppress a competitor had instead elevated that competitor into an even more powerful position while simultaneously diminishing their own standing within the league and among fans. What was also significant about this moment was how it demonstrated the fragility of institutional control in professional sports more broadly. This wasn't just a women's basketball issue. It was a fundamental reality of how power operates in any industry where success depends on the performance and participation of a small number of irreplaceable individuals. When your organization's entire value proposition is dependent on the goodwill of a specific superstar, you cannot treat that superstar with disrespect and expect compliance. You cannot attempt to control them through hierarchical authority alone. You must earn their cooperation through respect, fair treatment, and genuine recognition of their value. The WNBA had failed to do this, and now it was paying the price. The broader professional sports industry was watching this situation with significant interest. Other leagues were learning lessons from the WNBA's disaster. If the most prestigious women's basketball league in the world could collapse economically over the course of a single weekend because of a superstar player's refusal to participate, what did that say about the vulnerability of other organizations? Organizations began recognizing, perhaps for the first time, the true extent to which their prosperity was dependent on player goodwill and cooperation. This realization would eventually translate into changes in how players were treated, how compensation was structured, and how disputes with superstar players were handled. The situation also became a case study in what happens when institutional leadership fails to understand changing market dynamics. The WNBA had successfully built something genuinely valuable and genuinely profitable through women's basketball. But the executives running that situation had established her as not just the most talented player in women's basketball, but as the most powerful player in women's sports history. She demonstrated something extraordinary, a willingness to sacrifice personal gain in service of maintaining her dignity and integrity. She'd proven that she had genuine alternatives available to her and wasn't trapped in a dependent relationship with an organization she could walk away from. And she'd used that power not for personal enrichment, but for establishing a principle, that she would not accept disrespect regardless of professional consequences. This principle would define her relationship with professional women's basketball moving forward. Every organization would understand that Caitlin Clark couldn't be controlled through traditional hierarchical mechanisms. She had to be treated with respect and with recognition of her actual value. Any attempt to suppress her or take advantage of her would be met with the same response: complete withdrawal and a demonstration of how dependent the organization was on her participation. She'd essentially established a new standard for how superstar players in women's basketball could and should be treated. Looking back at that all-star weekend from a historical perspective, it would be remembered as the moment when women's professional basketball fundamentally changed. The old power structure collapsed. A new understanding of player leverage and institutional vulnerability emerged. Every player in every women's professional sport suddenly understood their power better. And the sport itself, despite the short-term economic pain of that weekend, emerged stronger because the false assumptions that had been governing its operations were finally exposed and could be replaced with more realistic and more sustainable frameworks. The wreckage of that all-star weekend slowly gave way to a complicated recovery process. The league offered Clark everything she wanted. She eventually returned, having proven something undeniable about power and leverage in professional sports. But you can't unbreak trust that's been shattered so publicly. You can't unsay things that have been exposed to the entire world. The WNBA would continue operating, but it would operate under fundamentally different assumptions about how power is distributed and how superstars must be treated. Caitlin Clark's refusal to accept disrespect, her willingness to sacrifice personal gain for principle, and her demonstrated leverage over an entire institution became the defining story of her career. She wasn't just the sport's best shooter or most exciting player. She was the player who forced a multi-billion-dollar organization to confront the reality of how dependent it was on her goodwill. That's a legacy far more powerful and far more consequential than any statistical achievement could ever be.